On February 28, 2026, the most famous building in the world went quiet. Not gradually, not as part of a planned shutdown, but suddenly, almost unnaturally, as smoke spread across downtown and the center of Dubai's global image was forced into silence. The observation decks closed, the fountains stopped, the lights dimmed, and within minutes, the busiest tourist district on Earth stood still. But the real disruption was not the evacuation itself. It was what that moment revealed. Because the Burj Khalifa was never just a building. It was a signal. A vertical statement designed to communicate something far beyond architecture. At 828 meters tall, with 163 floors rising into the skyline, it was not built simply to break records. It was built to define perception. To anchor Dubai in the global imagination as a place that operates at a different scale, under a different set of rules. In many ways, it functions less like infrastructure and more like symbolic machinery. Just as the Statue of Liberty came to represent freedom, or the Eiffel Tower came to embody Paris, the Burj Khalifa became a shorthand for modern ambition, for speed, for control, for a kind of engineered perfection that suggests limits no longer apply. And that is what people are really paying for when they visit. Not just the view, but the idea of standing at the highest point on Earth, looking down at a city that appears perfectly organized, perfectly functioning, perfectly controlled. It is not just elevation. It is perspective. The feeling of being above complexity, above chaos, above uncertainty. But that feeling depends on something very specific. It depends on the system working exactly as expected, and for years, it did. Millions of visitors moved through the tower, reinforcing the same narrative. Efficient entry, seamless flow, a premium experience that justified its position. The building didn't just attract attention, it converted it into belief. Belief that Dubai could deliver an experience at a scale and precision unmatched anywhere else. But beneath that surface, something else was beginning to form. Because as demand increased, as more people entered the system, as expectations rose alongside pricing, the internal experience began to stretch. Not visibly at first, not in a way that would disrupt the overall narrative, but enough to create pressure. A pressure that remained hidden, masked by the scale of the building and the strength of its global image. Until, eventually, it became impossible to ignore. And that raises a different kind of question. Not about what happened on that day, but about what was already happening long before it. Because if a system appears perfect from the outside but begins to strain from within, then the real story is not the moment it stops. It's the moment you realize it was already under pressure. To understand where that pressure comes from, you have to follow the experience the way a visitor does. It doesn't begin at the top of the tower. It begins inside the Dubai Mall. From the very first step, the positioning is clear. This is presented as a premium experience. Everything about the branding, the design, the language suggests exclusivity, precision, and control. You are not just entering a building, you are entering something elevated. And then the pricing appears. Access to levels 124 and 125 starts at around 169 dirhams, roughly $45. But that is only the baseline. During peak hours, especially sunset, those prices increase significantly. The next tier, level 148, climbs to around $100 to $110 per person. And the highest tier, the lounge experience across levels 152 to 154, can reach up to $175 per person. For a family of 4, the total cost can quickly approach $600 before the experience has even begun. And that is where expectations change. At that level, visitors are no longer paying casually. They are not just hoping for a good view. They are expecting a system that functions flawlessly. Efficiency, comfort, exclusivity, these are no longer optional. They are assumed. But what many encounter instead is something different. The first signs appear in the queues. Long lines forming at multiple checkpoints. Time slot tickets that suggest precision but do not translate into immediate access. Waiting areas that fill faster than they clear. Movement that becomes stop and go rather than seamless. And as the experience continues, that friction accumulates. What was expected to feel smooth begins to feel segmented. Controlled in theory, but constrained in practice. The journey becomes less about elevation and more about navigation, moving from one bottleneck to another, waiting, advancing, pausing again. Individually, these moments might seem minor. A delay here, a crowd there. But at this price point, small inefficiencies are not absorbed. They are amplified. Because luxury, in its true form, is not defined by what is added. It is defined by what is removed, the absence of waiting, the absence of crowding, the absence of friction. And when those elements reappear, even in subtle ways, the perception begins to shift. Visitors are not just evaluating what they see at the top. They are evaluating the entire journey, from entry to exit. And when enough people begin to report the same experience, long queues, overcrowded spaces, limited seating, refreshments that feel minimal compared to the price, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. It stops being anecdotal. It becomes structural. A gap begins to form, not between expectation and marketing, but between expectation and reality. And that gap is where pressure starts to build, because the system is still selling a premium experience. But it is no longer consistently delivering it in the way people expect. And once that gap becomes visible, even slightly, it changes how every future visitor approaches the experience. Not with certainty, but with caution. As that gap becomes more visible, the natural assumption is that it can be fixed. Improve management, adjust scheduling, add more staff, optimize the flow. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that this is not simply a management issue. It is a system limit, because the Burj Khalifa was not designed to scale infinitely. At its core, the visitor experience depends on vertical movement. Elevators are not just a feature of the building. They are the system itself. They regulate how many people can move through the structure at any given moment, and that capacity is fixed. There are only a limited number of primary elevators allocated for public access. Each carries a restricted number of passengers per trip. Even under optimal conditions, the system can only process a certain volume of visitors per minute. And during peak hours, especially around sunset, that volume is exceeded. This is where the bottleneck forms. No matter how efficiently the process is managed, no matter how precisely tickets are timed, the physical constraint remains. When more people arrive than the system can move, waiting becomes inevitable. Queues extend. Waiting times increase. The experience compresses. And what was designed to feel like a seamless vertical journey begins to fragment under its own weight. This is not a temporary inefficiency. It is a built-in limitation. A structural boundary that cannot be removed without fundamentally redesigning how people move through the building. And that is where the tension intensifies. Because demand continues to grow. The Burj Khalifa remains one of the most recognizable structures in the world. It attracts millions of visitors every year. For many, it is not just an option, it is a priority. A destination that sits at the top of a travel list, something to be completed, experienced, checked off. So demand concentrates, not evenly throughout the day, but around specific moments. Sunset, the exact point where the city transitions from daylight to illuminated skyline. The most photographed, most shared, most anticipated experience. And that concentration creates pressure. Thousands of people aiming for the same window. Moving through a system that cannot expand to accommodate them, which means the experience begins to change. Not because anything is malfunctioning, but because the system is operating at its limit. And when a system reaches its limit, every additional input reduces the quality of the output. More visitors do not enhance the experience. They dilute it. The sense of exclusivity begins to fade when spaces feel crowded. The perception of efficiency weakens when movement slows. The promise of a premium experience becomes harder to sustain when the environment feels compressed. And this creates a paradox. The more successful the attraction becomes, the more pressure it places on itself. The more demand it generates, the more it struggles to deliver the experience that demand expects. And for a time, that pressure can remain contained, balanced by the strength of the brand, masked by the scale of the structure, absorbed by the excitement of the experience itself. But once additional stress is introduced, even from outside the system, that balance becomes much harder to maintain. That additional stress arrived from outside the system. On February 28, 2026, the evacuation of the Burj Khalifa did not happen in isolation. It was part of a broader sequence of events unfolding across the city. Intercepted threats, drone activity, debris falling across parts of downtown. For a brief period, the environment surrounding the tower changed. Not permanently, but visibly. And that visibility is what matters. Because from an operational perspective, the system responded as designed. The building was cleared. Safety protocols were followed. No structural damage occurred. Within a short time, operations resumed. On paper, the event was controlled. But perception does not operate on paper. It operates on what people see. Images of smoke near the center of Dubai. Footage of evacuation. A skyline interrupted even briefly. These moments began circulating almost immediately, moving across platforms, shared and reshared, detached from context and reinterpreted in real time. And once that process begins, the narrative shifts. Not dramatically, but enough. Because what the audience sees is not a technical incident. They see disruption. And when disruption appears in a system that is built on the promise of control, it creates a contrast that is difficult to ignore. For years, Dubai positioned itself as a place where external instability does not reach the experience. That's where geopolitical tension remains outside the frame, where visitors can move through the city without feeling the uncertainty that exists elsewhere in the region. Now, for a moment, that boundary was visible, and that moment intersected with a system already under pressure, a premium experience struggling to maintain its consistency, a flow constrained by physical limitations, a growing gap between expectation and delivery. The shock did not create those conditions, it activated them. Because when external uncertainty enters a system that relies on predictability, even briefly, it changes how that system is evaluated. Visitors are no longer just asking what the experience offers. They begin asking what could interrupt it. And that question introduces something new. Hesitation. Not panic, not immediate withdrawal, but a pause. Like a reconsideration, and that hesitation begins to show up in behavior. Bookings are canceled. Not all at once, but enough to be noticeable. Travel plans are adjusted, some postponed, others redirected. Activity slows as both visitors and residents reassess the situation. Even businesses in nearby districts respond. Offices reduce staff presence. Operations shift to more flexible arrangements. The surrounding ecosystem, even if only temporarily, adjusts to the new context. And this is where the impact extends beyond the event itself. Because the physical structure remains unchanged. The Burj Khalifa still stands. The elevators still operate. The observation decks still open. But the context around it has shifted. And in tourism, context is not secondary. It is central. Because people are not just purchasing access to a location. And they are purchasing a sense of certainty. And when that certainty is disrupted, even briefly, it introduces friction into every decision that follows. And when that friction meets a system that was already operating near its limits, the effect is not just additive, it is compounding. What happens next is not driven by the event itself, but by how that event travels. Because the Burj Khalifa is not just another attraction, it is the visual identity of Dubai. It dominates the skyline. It anchors nearly every promotional image of the city. It appears in advertisements, films, social media, and travel content across the world. For many people who have never visited Dubai, the Burj Khalifa is Dubai, and that creates a unique dynamic. Anything that happens near it or appears to involve it is instantly magnified. And when the evacuation took place and images of smoke began circulating, the building was almost always in the frame. Not necessarily because it was the focus of the incident, but because it is impossible to separate the skyline from the structure that defines it. And once those images enter the digital ecosystem, they begin to change form. Clips are shortened, context is removed, moments are isolated, a few seconds of footage become a complete narrative, and that narrative spreads. Across platforms, across regions, across audiences, you are not evaluating the details of the event, but reacting to the impression it creates. This is where perception begins to amplify. Because in a digital environment, repetition matters more than precision. The same image seen multiple times begins to feel more significant than it actually is. And the same moment, replayed across different contexts, begins to suggest a broader pattern. And gradually, a new layer is added to how the system is perceived. Not dominant, not overwhelming, but present. A small but persistent association between the Burj Khalifa and the idea of disruption. And once that association exists, it becomes part of the decision-making process. Future visitors are not analyzing the technical details of what happened. They are recalling what they saw. A skyline interrupted, a building evacuated, a moment where control appeared to break, even if only briefly, and that is enough. Because perception does not need to be accurate to be influential. It only needs to be memorable. And in this case, the memory is tied to one of the most recognizable structures in the world. Which means the amplification effect is not local, it is global. Millions of people, many of whom were already considering Dubai as a destination, now have an additional variable in their decision framework. Not a dominant one, but a new one. And in a market where choices are abundant, where alternatives are readily available, even a small shift in perception can redirect demand, not dramatically, but gradually. And that is what makes this process difficult to detect in real time. because it does not happen through a single visible change. It happens through accumulation, through thousands of individual decisions, each slightly adjusted. Each influenced not by a full understanding of the event, but by the impression it left behind. And as those impressions accumulate, they begin to shape a broader narrative. One that exists independently of official statements, one that persists even after the system has returned to normal, and once that narrative begins to take hold, it becomes much harder to control. From this point forward, the future of the Burj Khalifa no longer follows a single predictable path. It begins to split. On one side, there is the model that Dubai has relied on for decades, a model built on speed, coordination, and control. Rapid response, aggressive marketing, policy adjustments, airline partnerships, visa flexibility, and large-scale investment designed to restore confidence as quickly as possible. It is a system that has proven, time and again, that it can bring demand back. After financial crises, after global slowdowns, after disruptions that affected travel worldwide, the pattern has remained consistent. And to stabilize perception, reignite demand, return to growth. And under this scenario, the Burj Khalifa continues to perform exactly as expected. Visitors return, the queues reform, the elevators operate at full capacity, the observation decks fill once again with thousands of people each day. From the outside, everything appears restored. But the second path does not depend on how quickly demand returns. It depends on what happens once it does. Because bringing people back into the system does not resolve the limitations inside it. The same elevators will continue to regulate the flow. The same peak hour congestion will reappear. The same gap between premium pricing and perceived value will persist. And as more visitors move through the system, those limitations do not disappear. They intensify. Because crowd management is not simply about capacity, it is about flow, timing, spacing, and expectation. And when expectations are high, even small inefficiencies become significant. A delay is no longer a delay. It is a failure to meet a promise. A crowded space is no longer just busy. It is a loss of exclusivity. A fragmented journey is no longer acceptable. It becomes a source of dissatisfaction. And when these experiences are repeated across thousands of visitors, they begin to accumulate. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Each visitor leaves with a slightly adjusted perception. Some satisfied, others less so. And those impressions do not stay contained. They are shared, documented, distributed across platforms where they reach audiences far beyond the original experience. Over time, this creates a different kind of pressure. Not the sudden pressure of a shock event, but the slow, cumulative pressure of repeated friction. And this is where the real risk begins to form. Because decline in systems like this rarely begins with absence. It begins with hesitation. A traveler comparing options pauses slightly longer. A decision shifts subtly. An alternative is chosen without announcement. And as these decisions accumulate, demand begins to move, quietly, gradually, until the change becomes visible only after it has already taken hold. So the question is no longer whether the Burj Khalifa will remain standing. It will. Its height will not change. Its global recognition will not disappear. Its ability to attract attention will remain intact. The real question is whether the experience inside it can evolve fast enough to protect what that attention represents. Because in a global market defined by choice, capturing attention is only the beginning. Holding it requires consistency. And once attention begins to move, bringing it back becomes far more difficult than keeping it in the first place. So when you look at the Burj Khalifa now, you are not just looking at a building. You are looking at a system at a crossroads. One path leads back to growth. The other leads to gradual erosion, and the difference between those paths will not be decided by how tall the building is, but by how well the experience inside it can keep up with what it promises.